My dad won custody of me and my diabetic little brother, then left us with his alcoholic mother while he deployed to Iraq, and she spent Tommy's insulin money on vodka until I found him in a diabetic coma after 3 days without his shots. But when CPS tried to save us, Dad flew home in his combat uniform and convinced everyone we were lying, because how could a decorated war hero choose an unfit caregiver while he started a media campaign about the system persecuting veterans? I was 12 when Dad left me and my little sister at his mother's house. He was leaving to Iraq for 10 months, and she was an alcoholic who hit us. The worst part was how just 2 weeks ago, he fought tooth and nail to get custody and take us from Mom. The first week was hell. Grandma would pass out on the couch by 3 p.m. and we'd have to fend for ourselves. Tommy had type 1 diabetes and needed his insulin at 6 p.m., but Grandma would be too hammered to remember. I tried to help, but I was just a kid and didn't really know what I was doing. Tommy started getting sick more often. He'd throw up and feel dizzy, but Grandma would just tell him to stop being dramatic. We started showing up to school looking like garbage. Our clothes were dirty, and we were always hungry because Grandma spent her money on alcohol instead of groceries. I made excuses for her when teachers asked questions about our appearance. The real trouble began when the neighbors started noticing. They'd see us outside at weird hours looking for food in their garbage cans. I remember knocking on one of their doors in the middle of the night, asking if they had any cold leftovers they weren't planning to eat. The woman looked so sad when she heard me. "Where's your grandmother, sweetie?" she asked me. "She's sleeping. She sleeps a lot because she works so much," I said. I was getting good at lying. The neighbor woman started leaving sandwiches on our porch. Other neighbors did too. And before I knew it, she called Child Protective Services for us. A woman named Caitlin came to investigate. She seemed nice at first and asked us a bunch of questions about Grandma. I wanted to tell her everything, but I was terrified of what Dad would do if he found out we snitched. "Is your grandmother taking good care of you?" Caitlin asked. I looked at Tommy, who was pale and shaky from missing his morning insulin. "Yeah, she takes good care of us," I lied. But Caitlin could see we were malnourished and dirty. She took notes and said she'd be back to check on us. I thought maybe things would finally change. But then Dad came home on emergency leave because Caitlin had contacted him. He showed up in his full combat uniform looking all official and intimidating. Caitlin was there waiting to talk to him, and I could tell she was nervous. "Sir, I've received some concerning reports about the children's care," she started. Dad cut her off immediately. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I've served 3 tours in Iraq defending this country. I think I know how to choose appropriate care for my children. My mother raised me and I turned out just fine." Caitlin shifted uncomfortably. "I understand your service, sir, but the neighbors have reported signs of neglect. Those neighbors are just anti-military liberals who don't like having a veteran's family in their neighborhood," Dad said. His voice was getting louder and more aggressive. "They're harassing my family while I'm overseas protecting their freedom." Caitlin started backing down. She mentioned something about her own son being deployed and how hard it was for military families. Dad nodded like they were best friends now. "My mother is family. She knows these kids better than some stranger neighbors," Dad said. "I trust her completely, and frankly, I'm offended that people are trying to attack a veteran's family." Caitlin apologized and said she wouldn't pursue it further. She left, and Dad went back to Iraq the next day. Before he left, he pulled me aside. "If you ever tell lies about Grandma again, you'll regret it," he said. "Grandma made me tough, and she'll make you tough too. Stop being weak." Things got so much worse after that. Grandma's drinking increased, and she started laying hands on us when we asked for food or reminded her about Tommy's insulin. The neighbors still tried to help, but they felt powerless since CPS had dismissed their concerns. Tommy was getting sicker and sicker. Then the worst thing happened. Dad went on another deployment, and Grandma forgot Tommy's insulin for 3 straight days. I watched my little brother deteriorate hour by hour. He was throwing up constantly and could barely stay awake. His breathing got really weird and shallow. "Tommy, you need to stay with me," I kept saying, but he was slipping in and out of consciousness. I finally called 911 when he wouldn't wake up at all. The paramedics rushed him to the hospital, and the doctors said he was in something called diabetic ketoacidosis. They said he almost died. A different social worker named Maria came to the hospital. She looked at Tommy's medical records and saw the pattern of missed insulin doses and neglect, and she didn't care about Dad's military service or Grandma being family. "This is medical neglect and it's life-threatening," she told me. "I'm filing an emergency petition with the judge today." She bypassed the local CPS office completely and went straight to family court, and before I even realized it, our dad had been contacted, and he was once again on a plane home, ready to take me back. Dad's presence filled the hospital room like a storm cloud. He walked past Maria without acknowledging her, his boots clicking against the linoleum floor. I watched him approach Tommy's bed where my little brother lay hooked up to monitors and IV drips. The machines beeped steadily, tracking his heart rate and blood sugar levels that the doctors were still trying to stabilize. "What happened to my son?" Dad's voice carried that dangerous edge I knew too well. He turned to face me, and I felt my stomach drop. His jaw was clenched tight, and I could see the muscle twitching beneath his skin. Maria stepped forward, holding a thick folder of medical records. "Mr. Thompson, your son nearly died from diabetic ketoacidosis. The hospital records show a pattern of missed insulin doses over the past several weeks." Dad's eyes narrowed. He straightened his shoulders, making himself look even more imposing in his military fatigues. "And who exactly are you?" "I'm Maria Rodriguez, a social worker with the county. I've been assigned to investigate this case of medical neglect." "Medical neglect?" Dad's voice rose slightly. "My mother has been caring for these children while I serve our country. Any issues with Tommy's care are simply misunderstandings." I pressed myself against the wall, trying to become invisible. Maria opened the folder and pulled out several documents. "These are Tommy's blood sugar logs from his previous hospital visits. The pattern is clear. He's been admitted 3 times in the past month, each time with dangerously high blood sugar levels." Dad snatched the papers from her hands and scanned them quickly. His face darkened with each page he read. "Where did you get these?" "They're part of Tommy's medical record. Any healthcare provider can access them with proper authorization." Maria remained calm despite Dad's aggressive stance. The door opened and a doctor entered, a middle-aged woman with graying hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked between Dad and Maria before focusing on Tommy's chart. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Dr. Patel. I've been treating your son." Dad immediately shifted his approach, extending his hand with a practiced smile. "Doctor, thank you for taking care of my boy. When can we take him home?" Dr. Patel didn't return the smile. "Your son almost died, Mr. Thompson. His blood sugar was over 600 when he arrived. He was in a diabetic coma. This level of neglect could have been fatal." "Neglect is a strong word, doctor." Dad's charm offensive continued. "My mother is elderly and sometimes forgets things. I'll make sure she has better reminders for his insulin schedule." Dr. Patel shook her head. "This goes beyond simple forgetfulness. Tommy's A1C levels indicate poor blood sugar control for months. He's severely malnourished and shows signs of dehydration. These are indicators of systemic neglect." I watched Dad's hands clench into fists at his sides. Maria noticed too, and subtly positioned herself between Dad and the doctor. "Mr. Thompson, we need to discuss alternative care arrangements for your children." "Alternative arrangements?" Dad's voice dropped to a low growl. These are my children. I decide what's best for them. The court will make that determination, Maria said firmly. I've already filed the emergency petition. There's a hearing scheduled for tomorrow morning. Dad's face turned red. He took a step toward Maria, and I instinctively moved closer to Tommy's bed. You have no right. I'm serving this country, protecting people like you, and this is how you repay me? Dr. Patel pressed a button on the wall. Mr. Thompson, I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice. This is a pediatric ward. 2 security guards appeared in the doorway. Dad noticed them and took a deep breath, visibly trying to control his anger. He turned back to Maria. This is a mistake. My mother raised me and my siblings just fine. She's family. Family takes care of family. Family doesn't let children nearly die from preventable medical emergencies, Maria responded. The evidence is clear. Your mother is unable to provide adequate care. Dad looked at me then, and I saw something shift in his expression. It was calculating, almost predatory. Son, tell them. Tell them how well Grandma takes care of you. My mouth went dry. I looked at Tommy, still unconscious in the hospital bed, then at Maria, who was watching me with concerned eyes. Dr. Patel moved closer to me, creating a subtle barrier between Dad and where I stood. My voice cracked. I cleared my throat and tried again. Grandma drinks a lot. The words hung in the air like a confession. Dad's face went from red to purple. Boy, you don't know what you're saying. You're confused and scared. Maria stepped forward. Let him speak, Mr. Thompson. But I couldn't say anything else. My throat felt like it was closing up. Dad's stare bore into me, and I knew there would be consequences later. There always were. Talk about Dad pulling the I served my country card faster than a magician with a rabbit. Except instead of making problems disappear, he's just making everyone uncomfortable while his kid's hooked up to more machines than a gaming setup. Dr. Patel intervened. I think we should let Tommy rest. Mr. Thompson, visiting hours are ending soon. I'm not leaving my son, Dad said flatly. Actually, given the circumstances, I think it's best if the children have some space, Maria said. She pulled out her phone. I can have security escort you out if necessary. Dad's jaw worked silently for a moment. Then he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Fine, I'll go. But this isn't over. I'll see you in court tomorrow, and we'll see what a judge thinks about someone trying to tear apart a military family. He walked to the door, then paused and looked back at me. I'll be staying at Grandma's tonight. We have a lot to discuss. After he left, my whole body started shaking. Maria sat down in the chair next to me and put a gentle hand on my shoulder. You did the right thing. I know that was hard. He's going to cull me, I whispered. No, he's not. You're not going back there tonight. I've arranged for emergency placement. You'll stay somewhere safe until the hearing. Dr. Patel checked Tommy's monitors again. He should wake up soon. His blood sugar is stabilizing nicely, but he's going to need consistent care going forward. No more missed doses. I nodded, feeling tears burn my eyes. I tried to help him. I really did. But I didn't know how to use the insulin pen properly, and Grandma would get mad if I touched her things. None of this is your fault, Dr. Patel said firmly. You're 12 years old. You shouldn't have to be responsible for your brother's medical care. Maria's phone buzzed. She checked it and frowned. Your father just called my supervisor. He's claiming I'm discriminating against him because of his military service. Is that going to work? I asked, fear creeping back in. Number. The medical evidence is too strong, but he's going to fight this hard. She looked at me seriously. I need you to be prepared for tomorrow. The judge will want to hear from you. I can't testify against Dad. He'll never forgive me. You won't be testifying against him. You'll be telling the truth about what happened to Tommy. There's a difference, but I knew Dad wouldn't see it that way. In his world, loyalty to family meant silence no matter what. Breaking that code was the ultimate betrayal. A soft groan came from the bed. Tommy's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. Where am I? I jumped up and grabbed his hand. You're in the hospital. You got really sick, but you're going to be okay. He looked around slowly, taking in the machines and IV lines. My head hurts. Dr. Patel moved to his side, checking his pupils with a small light. That's normal, Tommy. You've been very sick, but you're getting better now. Where's Grandma? He asked. Maria and I exchanged glances. She's at home, I said carefully. Good, Tommy whispered. She was really mad about something. I don't remember what. Maria made another note in her file. Every detail mattered now, building the case that would determine our future. I sat back down, still holding Tommy's hand, and tried not to think about what Dad was doing at Grandma's house. Probably coaching her on what to say, making sure their stories matched. The emergency placement Maria arranged was a foster home about 20 minutes from the hospital. The family seemed nice enough. An older couple named the Johnsons who had a quiet house that smelled like vanilla candles. They showed me to a small bedroom with a twin bed and a desk. The bathroom is down the hall, Mrs. Johnson said softly. There are clean towels in the closet. Are you hungry? I shook my head, even though I hadn't eaten all day. My stomach was too twisted with anxiety to handle food. After they left me alone, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my hands. They were still shaking slightly. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Dad's face in the hospital room. The way his expression had shifted from charm to rage and back again. I knew he was planning something. He always had a plan. The next morning, Mrs. Johnson drove me to the courthouse. The building was old and intimidating, with tall columns and heavy wooden doors. Maria met us in the lobby, carrying a thick briefcase. How's Tommy? I asked immediately. He's doing better. Still in the hospital, but improving. Dr. Patel will be testifying by phone about his condition. She led us through security and down a long hallway. The hearing is in family court. It's less formal than regular court, but you still need to tell the truth. We entered a small courtroom with wood paneling and fluorescent lights. Dad was already there, sitting at a table with a man in a suit who must have been his lawyer. Grandma sat behind them in the gallery, wearing her church dress and looking more sober than I'd seen her in months. Dad had cleaned up too. His uniform was perfectly pressed, and he'd shaved carefully. He looked like the ideal soldier, the kind of person you'd trust with anything. He didn't look at me as we took our seats at the opposite table. The judge entered, an older black woman with short gray hair and glasses perched on her nose. She reviewed the papers in front of her before looking up at the courtroom. This is an emergency hearing regarding the custody of 2 minor children. I've reviewed the petition and the medical records. Let's start with the social worker's report. Maria stood and began presenting the evidence. She was thorough and clinical, laying out the pattern of neglect, the missed insulin doses, the multiple hospitalizations. She showed photos of our living conditions at Grandma's house, the empty refrigerator, the bottles hidden throughout the rooms. Dad's lawyer objected several times, arguing that the photos were taken without permission, that the medical records were being misinterpreted, that this was a targeted attack on a military family. The judge overruled most of his objections, but allowed him to make his arguments. When it was Dad's turn to speak, he transformed. Gone was the angry man from the hospital. In his place stood a devoted father, worn down by military service, doing his best in impossible circumstances. Your Honor, I've served 3 tours in Iraq. I've sacrificed everything for this country and my children. When their mother proved unfit, I fought for custody because I wanted to give them stability. I trusted my mother to care for them while I fulfilled my duty to our nation. He went on about the challenges of military families, the lack of support systems, the judgment from civilians who didn't understand sacrifice. Several times he mentioned his medals, his commendations, his perfect service record. Grandma testified next, and I barely recognized recognized her. She spoke clearly about her love for us, how she'd done her best despite her age and health issues. She admitted to being forgetful sometimes, but denied drinking excessively. She claimed the bottles in the photos were old, from before we'd moved in. Then it was my turn. My legs felt like jelly as I walked to the witness stand. The judge smiled at me kindly. Just tell the truth, son. That's all we need. Dad's lawyer started with easy questions. My name, my age, how long I'd lived with Grandma. Then he got to the hard parts. Has your grandmother ever hurt you? I glanced at Dad. His expression was neutral, but I could see the warning in his eyes. Sometimes she gets upset. That's not what I asked. Has she ever physically hurt you? My hands gripped the edge of the witness box. Yes. Can you be more specific? I described some of the incidents, keeping my voice as steady as I could. The lawyer tried to minimize each one, suggesting I was exaggerating or misremembering. But Maria had prepared me for this, and I stuck to the facts. What about your father? How does he treat you? This was the minefield. I chose my words carefully. He has high expectations. Does he love you? Yes. Does he want what's best for you? I hesitated. The judge leaned forward slightly. You can take your time. He wants us to be strong, I finally said. He thinks Grandma's house makes us strong. The lawyer pressed further, but I'd found my rhythm. I answered truthfully but carefully, trying to paint the picture without directly accusing Dad of anything that would make him retaliate later. Dr. Patel's testimony came through the courtroom phone. She was blunt about Tommy's condition and the severity of the neglect. She used medical terms I didn't understand, but her conclusion was clear. Tommy could have died, and would die if returned to the same situation. The judge asked Dad directly about the medical neglect. He had an answer for everything. Grandma was getting older and needed help remembering. He'd been trying to arrange support services, but the military bureaucracy was slow. He'd had no idea things had gotten so bad because no one had told him. Your son tried to tell a social worker weeks ago, the judge pointed out. Children sometimes exaggerate for attention, Your Honor. My deployment has been hard on them. They're acting out. The hearing went on for hours. Each side presented evidence, made arguments, pointed fingers. Through it all, I watched Dad perform. He was good at it, switching between devoted father, wounded veteran, and victim of an unfair system as needed. Finally, the judge called for a recess to make her decision. We waited in the hallway, Maria talking quietly with her supervisor on the phone. Dad and his lawyer huddled in a corner, strategizing. Grandma sat on a bench, looking older and more fragile than usual. When we returned to the courtroom, the judge's expression was serious. This is a difficult case. On one hand, we have a father serving his country, trying to provide for his children under challenging circumstances. On the other hand, we have clear medical evidence of life-threatening neglect. She continued, outlining the facts as she saw them. My heart pounded as she built toward her decision. The court finds that returning the children to their grandmother's care would pose an immediate risk to their health and safety. The judge building tension like she's hosting a reality show finale while Tommy's life hangs in the balance. Now that's what I call courtroom drama with terrible timing. Someone needs to tell her this isn't America's Got Custody. Temporary custody is granted to the Department of Children's Services pending a full investigation and permanent custody hearing. Dad shot to his feet. Your Honor, this is wrong. These are my children. Sit down, Mr. Thompson, or I'll hold you in contempt. The judge's voice was steel. You'll have the opportunity to present a comprehensive plan for their care at the permanent hearing. Until then, they remain in foster care. She set the next hearing for 3 months out, giving Dad time to make arrangements that didn't involve Grandma. As we left the courtroom, Dad caught my arm. This isn't over, he said quietly. You're still my son. Remember that. Maria intervened, guiding me away, but I could feel his eyes on my back as we walked down the hallway. I knew he was already planning his next move. Dad always had a plan. The drive back to the Johnsons' house felt surreal. Mrs. Johnson kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror, her eyes full of concern. I stared out the window, watching familiar streets pass by, knowing Dad was somewhere out there plotting his next move. Back at the foster home, I tried to eat the sandwich Mrs. Johnson made, but my hands wouldn't stop trembling. Every car that passed outside made me jump. I knew Dad's tactics. He'd start small, testing boundaries, finding weaknesses. The first sign came that evening. Mr. Johnson answered a knock at the door, and I heard Dad's voice, calm and reasonable. My blood turned to ice. I crept to the top of the stairs, listening as Dad explained he just wanted to check on his son, make sure I was comfortable. Mr. Johnson politely but firmly told him visits needed to be arranged through Maria. Dad thanked him for taking care of me, his voice dripping with false gratitude. After he left, Mrs. Johnson found me huddled on the stairs. She helped me back to my room and sat on the edge of the bed. I told her about Dad's methods, how he'd charm people first, make them think he was reasonable. She listened carefully and promised they'd be careful. The next morning, Maria called. Dad had filed a complaint with her supervisor, claiming she'd violated protocol, that she had a personal vendetta against military families. He'd also contacted the foster care licensing board, suggesting the Johnsons were poisoning me against him. Maria assured me these tactics wouldn't work, but I could hear the strain in her voice. At the hospital, Tommy was improving. The nurses let me sit with him while he ate his first solid meal in days. He asked about Grandma again, and I told him she was sick and couldn't visit. It wasn't entirely a lie. Dr. Patel showed me how to properly administer insulin, teaching me the correct technique I desperately tried to figure out on my own at Grandma's house. On the third day, things escalated. Dad showed up at the hospital during my visit with Tommy. He walked in wearing his dress uniform, medals gleaming. The nurses practically swooned. He brought Tommy a teddy bear and me a book about military heroes. He acted like the perfect father, asking the nurses about Tommy's care, thanking them profusely for their dedication. He pulled me aside near the vending machines. His grip on my shoulder looked affectionate to anyone watching, but his fingers dug in hard. He spoke quietly about family loyalty, about how disappointed he was, about how things could be so much easier if I just told the truth. When Maria arrived for her scheduled visit, Dad was sitting by Tommy's bed, reading him a story, the picture of fatherly devotion. That night, the Johnsons received multiple phone calls. The first few were hang-ups. Then came calls from Dad's military buddies, explaining what a good man he was, how this was all a misunderstanding. One caller suggested the Johnsons didn't understand military families, that they were being manipulated by a bitter child. The psychological warfare intensified over the next week. Dad filed a formal complaint with the military, claiming Maria was harassing him and interfering with his service. He started a social media campaign, posting photos of himself in uniform with carefully worded messages about fighting for his children while serving his country. Comments poured in supporting the devoted soldier father being persecuted by the system. At school, which I'd started attending from the foster home, military recruiters suddenly became very interested in visiting my classes. They'd tell stories about honor, duty, and family values. One mentioned how sad it was when children betrayed their parents. The message was clear. Dad began showing up everywhere, always maintaining legal distance but making his presence known. He'd be at the grocery store when Mrs. Johnson took me shopping. He'd drive past the school during recess. He'd sit in the hospital cafeteria during my visits with Tommy, reading a newspaper, never approaching but always watching. The pressure was working on everyone. The Johnsons started receiving negative reviews on their foster care profile intel from anonymous sources. Maria's supervisor called her in for multiple meetings about the complaints. Even Dr. Patel mentioned that someone had questioned her medical license, suggesting she was exaggerating Tommy's condition. 2 weeks before the permanent custody hearing, Dad made his boldest move. He arranged for a local news station to interview him about the challenges facing military families. He sat in his apartment, surrounded by photos of us and his military commendations, speaking eloquently about the sacrifices he'd made and how the system was failing veterans. He never mentioned the neglect or Tommy's near-death experience. Instead, he painted a picture of a devoted father being punished for serving his country. The interview aired during prime time. Within hours, Maria's office was flooded with calls supporting Dad. The Johnsons started finding notes on their car windshield calling them unpatriotic. Someone spray-painted "Support our troops" on their garage door. I felt the walls closing in. Dad was winning the public relations war. He'd turned us into symbols, me into the ungrateful child, and himself into the persecuted hero. Maria warned me he was building a case that the entire system was biased against him. During this time, Tommy remained in the hospital longer than expected. His blood sugar levels kept spiking whenever he got stressed, which happened every time Dad visited. Dr. Patel documented everything, noting that Tommy's anxiety seemed directly correlated to Dad's presence. Dad countered by bringing in a private specialist who suggested Tommy's condition was exacerbated by the trauma of being separated from his family. The foster home became a pressure cooker. Mr. Johnson started having trouble at work after someone called his employer, suggesting he was harboring a child who'd been coached to lie about a war hero. Mrs. Johnson found her car tires slashed one morning. They never said anything to me, but I could see the strain wearing on them. Dad's lawyer sent multiple letters demanding increased visitation, psychological evaluations to prove I'd been coached, and immediate return of custody. Each letter was copied to Maria's supervisors, the judge, and various military advocacy groups. The lawyer painted a picture of systematic discrimination against a decorated veteran. 3 weeks into foster care, I made a decision that would change everything. I started keeping a journal, documenting everything I remembered about life at Grandma's house. I wrote about the empty insulin vials I'd find hidden under couch cushions, the times I'd tried to wake Grandma to help Tommy, the bruises we'd hidden with long sleeves. I included dates, times, specific incidents. It was painful to relive, but I knew memories could be questioned. Written records were harder to dismiss. Maria helped me submit the journal to the court, but Dad's lawyer immediately challenged its authenticity. He suggested I'd been coached to write it, that the timing was suspicious. He demanded handwriting analysis and psychological testing to determine if I was being manipulated. The psychological evaluation was grueling. The court-appointed psychologist asked probing questions about my relationship with Dad, with Grandma, with Mom. Dad had prepped well for this, having already submitted his own psychological evaluation from a military psychiatrist who testified to his mental fitness and dedication to his children. During my evaluation, I tried to walk the tightrope between truth and self-preservation. I knew Dad would read every word of the report. I had to be honest enough to protect Tommy, but careful enough to avoid triggering Dad's worst retaliation. The psychologist noted my hypervigilance, my tendency to minimize negative experiences, my protective instincts toward Tommy. She wrote that these were consistent with a child who'd taken on adult responsibilities too young. Dad's lawyer spun this as evidence of coaching, suggesting Maria had taught me to display these symptoms. Meanwhile, Tommy's condition became the key battleground. Dad brought in medical experts who testified that diabetes management could be challenging for elderly caregivers, that missed doses weren't necessarily neglect. They suggested Tommy's condition had been complicated by the stress of separation from his family. Dr. Patel fought back with hard data. She presented Tommy's blood sugar logs, showing the clear pattern of deterioration under Grandma's care versus his improvement in the hospital. She explained how close Tommy had come to death, how diabetic ketoacidosis could cause permanent organ damage, but Dad's experts countered that the hospital environment itself could account for the improvement. The community pressure intensified. A veterans advocacy group started a petition demanding Dad receive full custody. They organized rallies outside the courthouse, waving American flags and holding signs about supporting military families. Tommy's blood sugar spiking every time Dad visits is basically his body's way of filing its own custody complaint. Guess even diabetes knows when to pick a side in this mess. Local politicians began weighing in, careful not to appear anti-veteran. One particularly bad night, someone threw a rock through the Johnsons' window. Attached was a note calling them traitors who were destroying a military family. The police came, took a report, but said without witnesses there was little they could do. I heard Mr. Johnson talking to his wife about whether they could continue fostering me. Dad escalated his campaign by reaching out to military media outlets. He gave interviews about the unique challenges of deployed parents, how the system didn't understand military culture. He spoke movingly about missing birthdays and holidays while serving overseas, how all he wanted was to come home to his children. The narrative was shifting. Instead of a father who'd endangered his children, Dad was becoming a symbol of how America failed its veterans. Online forums lit up with support for him. People who'd never met us had strong opinions about our family. Maria was drowning in paperwork and complaints. Her supervisor assigned another worker to review her handling of the case. Dad's lawyer suggested Maria had a bias against military families, pointing to a case from years earlier where she'd removed children from another veteran's home. At school, I became isolated. Word had spread about who my father was, and kids either avoided me or accused me of being unpatriotic. Teachers looked at me with pity or suspicion. One substitute teacher made a pointed comment about children who didn't appreciate their parents' sacrifices. The Johnsons tried to shield me, but I could see them breaking. They'd fostered dozens of children over the years, but they'd never faced this level of harassment. Mrs. Johnson started having panic attacks. Mr. Johnson installed security cameras after finding their garbage cans overturned multiple times. 5 weeks into foster care, Dad played his ace. He announced he was retiring from the military to focus on his children. He held a press conference at the VFW Hall, surrounded by fellow veterans. He spoke about choosing his children over his career, the ultimate sacrifice for a soldier. He produced a job offer from a local security firm, proving he could provide stable employment. This changed the entire dynamic. The main argument for keeping us in foster care had been Dad's deployments. Now he was removing that obstacle, painting himself as a father who'd given up everything for his children. The veterans community rallied even harder around him. Tommy was finally released from the hospital to a specialized medical foster home. I was only allowed supervised visits now, as Dad's lawyer had argued my presence might coach Tommy to say negative things about their father. During our brief visits, Tommy seemed confused and withdrawn. He kept asking when we could go home, though he couldn't articulate where home was anymore. The permanent custody hearing approached like a storm. Dad's lawyer filed motion after motion, demanding access to all medical records, all communication between Maria and her supervisors, any notes from the foster families. He was building a case that the entire system was conspiring against a war hero. Maria worked tirelessly to counter each move. She gathered statements from neighbors who'd witnessed the neglect, compiled Tommy's complete medical history, documented the pattern of Dad's manipulation and intimidation, but for every piece of evidence she presented, Dad's team had a counter-narrative. The weekend before the hearing, Dad made one final push. He organized a candlelight vigil outside the courthouse, framing it as a prayer gathering for separated military families. Hundreds attended. Local news covered it extensively. He spoke about forgiveness, about healing, about bringing his family back together. He even suggested he'd get counseling to be a better father. I watched the news coverage from the Johnsons' living room, feeling sick. Dad had successfully transformed our story from one of child endangerment to one of government overreach. He'd weaponized his military service, turned public opinion into a shield. Mrs. Johnson sat beside me, her hand on my shoulder. She told me that truth had a way of surfacing, that the judge would see through the manipulation, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. We all knew how powerful Dad's narrative had become. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Tommy, about how many more times his blood sugar might crash if we went back. I thought about Grandma, who'd been surprisingly quiet through all of this, probably coached by Dad to maintain her image. Maria called early that morning with updates. Dad had submitted letters of support from dozens of military personnel, community leaders, even a state senator. He'd completed a parenting class and had certificates to prove it. He'd set up Tommy's future medical care with a respected endocrinologist. On paper, he looked like a reformed father who'd done everything right. As Mrs. Johnson drove me to the courthouse, I saw the crowds already gathering. Veterans in uniform, families with American flags, news vans lining the street. Dad had turned our custody hearing into a political event. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense. The small courtroom was packed with Dad's supporters. They wore yellow ribbons and military pins. When Dad entered in his dress uniform, they stood in respect. He'd orchestrated every detail perfectly. Maria squeezed my hand as we took our seats. She'd warned me this would be hard, that Dad would pull out all the stops. But seeing the full force of his campaign was overwhelming. He'd turned public opinion into a weapon, and he was aiming it directly at anyone who stood between him and his goal. The judge entered, and I could see her taking in the packed courtroom with concern. She reminded everyone this was about the best interests of two children, not politics or public opinion. But I wondered how she could possibly ignore the pressure Dad had created. As the hearing began, I realized Dad had one more surprise waiting, but that revelation would come soon enough. For now, I sat between Maria and Mrs. Johnson, trying to steady my breathing, knowing that everything we'd fought for over the past 2 months was about to be decided. The real battle was just beginning. The judge called Dad's surprise witness to the stand. A man in military dress blues walked forward, his chest covered in ribbons and medals. He introduced himself as Colonel Robert Daniels, Dad's former commanding officer. My heart sank as he began describing Dad's exemplary service record, his leadership under fire, his dedication to his unit. Colonel Daniels painted Dad as a hero who'd saved lives in combat, who'd sacrificed everything for his country. He testified about the psychological toll of deployment, how soldiers struggled to readjust to civilian life. He suggested that any parenting mistakes Dad made were symptoms of his service, not character flaws. Maria objected, arguing that military service didn't excuse child endangerment. The judge allowed the testimony to continue, but reminded everyone that the focus was on the children's safety, not Dad's military record. Dad's lawyer then called a series of character witnesses. Fellow veterans testified about Dad's integrity. His landlord described him as a model tenant. His new employer from the security firm praised his work ethic and reliability. Each witness reinforced the narrative of a good man being unfairly persecuted. When Maria's turn came to present rebuttal evidence, she focused on the medical facts. She introduced Tommy's complete hospital records, showing not just the recent crisis, but a pattern of emergency room visits stretching back months. She presented photographs of Tommy taken during each admission, showing his progressive deterioration under Grandma's care. The most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. A nurse from Tommy's previous hospital visits had kept personal notes about our condition. She'd documented bruises, malnutrition, and Tommy's repeated statements about being hungry and missing his insulin. Her notes predated any custody dispute, making them harder to dismiss as biased. Dad's lawyer attacked the nurse's credibility, suggesting she'd violated patient privacy by keeping personal notes. He argued that her observations were subjective and unprofessional, but the damage was done. The judge had seen the pattern of neglect documented by a neutral third party. Dr. Patel testified again, this time in person. She brought Tommy's blood work results, explaining in detail how prolonged high blood sugar damaged organs. She showed brain scans revealing early signs of damage from the diabetic coma. She stated clearly that returning Tommy to an environment where his medical needs were neglected would likely result in permanent disability or death. Dad's medical expert tried to minimize the findings, suggesting the damage was reversible with proper care. He emphasized that Dad had already arranged excellent medical care for Tommy going forward, but Dr. Patel countered with statistics about diabetic children who suffered repeated ketoacidosis episodes. The mortality rates were sobering. The judge then heard from the court-appointed child advocate, a woman named Mrs. Chen, who'd been assigned to represent Tommy's interests. She'd interviewed Tommy multiple times and observed his interactions with various family members. Her report was devastating for Dad's case. Mrs. Chen described Tommy's fear responses when Dad's name was mentioned. She documented how Tommy's blood sugar spiked during Dad's hospital visits. She'd observed Tommy having nightmares about going back to Grandma's house. Most importantly, she'd recorded Tommy saying he felt safe for the first time in the medical foster home. Dad's composure finally cracked. He stood up, despite his lawyer's attempts to stop him, and addressed the judge directly. Colonel Daniels really rolled out the entire military resume like it's a get out of child endangerment free card, because nothing says good parenting like listing your combat medals while your kid's brain scans show damage from medical neglect. He talked about the burden of command, about making life and death decisions in combat. He argued that his methods might seem harsh to civilians, but they were designed to create strong, resilient children who could survive in a dangerous world. The judge had to threaten contempt charges to get Dad to sit down. His outburst had damaged his carefully crafted image. Some of his supporters in the gallery looked uncomfortable. The mask of the devoted father had slipped, revealing the controlling soldier underneath. Maria called her final witness, me. I walked to the witness stand on shaky legs, knowing this was my last chance to protect Tommy. Dad's lawyer immediately objected, arguing I'd already testified. The judge overruled him, noting that new evidence had been presented that I could address. Maria asked me about the journal I'd kept. I explained how I'd started documenting things after realizing my memories might be questioned. I described specific incidents, finding Tommy unconscious on the bathroom floor, Grandma too hammered to wake up when I screamed for help, trying to call 911 but Grandma ripping the phone from the wall, Dad calling from Iraq and telling me to handle it like a man when I begged for help. Dad's lawyer cross-examined me aggressively. He suggested I'd been coached to write the journal that Maria had told me what to include. He pointed out inconsistencies in dates, implying I was lying. He asked why I hadn't told teachers or other adults if things were really that bad. I explained about Dad's threats, about how he'd convinced me that foster care would be worse than Grandma's house. I described the fear of being separated from Tommy, of being blamed for breaking up our family. I talked about trying to protect Tommy myself because I didn't trust anyone else to do it. The lawyer pushed harder, trying to make me admit I'd exaggerated or lied, but I had truth on my side. Every incident I described was real, burned into my memory. When he suggested I was being dramatic about Tommy's condition, I described watching my little brother's lips turn blue, his breathing becoming shallow, thinking he was dying in my arms. The judge finally intervened, telling the lawyer to move on, but I could see she'd been affected by my testimony. Several people in the gallery were wiping their eyes, including some of Dad's supporters. During a brief recess, I overheard heated discussions in the hallway. Some of Dad's veteran friends were arguing among themselves. The narrative was fracturing. Supporting a fellow veteran was one thing, but endangering children was another. The medical evidence was too strong to ignore. When we reconvened, Dad's lawyer made his closing argument. He acknowledged that mistakes had been made, but argued they were correctable. He emphasized Dad's military service, his sacrifice, his commitment to improving. He painted a picture of a family that could heal if given the chance. Maria's closing was methodical and fact-based. She walked through the timeline of neglect, the escalating medical crises, the pattern of manipulation and intimidation. She argued that Dad had repeatedly chosen his image over his children's safety. She asked the judge to consider what would happen the next time Tommy's blood sugar crashed if we were returned to Dad's care. The judge announced she would render her decision after a short recess. Those 20 minutes felt like hours. I sat between Maria and Mrs. Johnson, trying not to look at Dad. His supporters had grown quieter, some leaving the courtroom entirely. When the judge returned, her expression was grave. She began by acknowledging the complexity of the case, the competing interests at stake. She recognized Dad's service to the country, but stated firmly that military service didn't grant immunity from parental responsibilities. She reviewed the medical evidence, finding it compelling and disturbing. She noted the pattern of escalating neglect, the multiple opportunities Dad had to intervene, his choice to prioritize his career over his children's safety. She found Grandma unfit to provide care due to her alcoholism and history of physical abuse. The judge then addressed Dad's recent efforts to regain custody. While she acknowledged the positive steps he'd taken, she found them insufficient given the severity of past neglect. She was particularly concerned by his attempts to manipulate public opinion and intimidate witnesses. Her ruling was decisive. Permanent custody was awarded to the Department of Children's Services. Dad's parental rights weren't terminated, but any future relationship would require extensive rehabilitation and supervised visitation. Grandma was prohibited from unsupervised contact with us. Dad erupted. He shouted about injustice, about a system biased against veterans. Security moved toward him, but his lawyer managed to calm him down. As they escorted him out, he looked at me with such hatred that I knew this wasn't over. Not for him. The courtroom slowly emptied. Maria hugged me, tears in her eyes. She promised to find us a good permanent placement, maybe even together if we were lucky. Mrs. Johnson squeezed my shoulder, telling me how brave I'd been. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had largely dispersed. A few protesters remained, but their energy had dissipated. The story had become too complicated for simple slogans about supporting troops. Children's lives were at stake. In the following days, the harassment stopped. The phone calls ended. The vandalism ceased. Dad's narrative had collapsed under the weight of evidence. Some of his supporters even reached out to apologize, saying they hadn't known the full story. Tommy and I were placed together in a therapeutic foster home run by a couple experienced with traumatized children. They understood medical needs and had protocols for managing Tommy's diabetes. For the first time in months, I slept through the night without worrying about insulin schedules. Dad tried one last manipulation. He sent a letter through his lawyer, not to the court, but to me personally. He wrote about forgiveness, about family bonds, about how I'd regret my choices when I was older. He suggested that when I turned 18, we could reconnect without the court's interference. I showed the letter to my therapist. We talked about manipulation tactics, about how abusers often portrayed themselves as victims. She helped me understand that protecting Tommy wasn't betrayal. It was love. Real love, not the twisted version Dad had taught us. 6 months later, Tommy's health had stabilized. His blood sugar was controlled, his weight normal. The brain damage from the diabetic coma was minimal, though he'd always need extra help with certain tasks. He smiled again, played again, acted like the child he was supposed to be. I started high school in our new district. Nobody knew our story. I was just another kid, not the ungrateful son who'd betrayed a war hero. I made friends who knew nothing about military culture or family loyalty tests. It was freedom I'd never imagined. Dad eventually stopped fighting. His lawyer informed the court that he was focusing on his new career and wouldn't pursue further custody actions. I suspected the legal fees had become overwhelming, or maybe his new employer didn't appreciate the notoriety. Either way, the calls and letters stopped. Grandma entered a treatment program, though I doubted it would stick. She'd been drinking for longer than I'd been alive, but at least she was away from other vulnerable children. That was what mattered. The permanent foster family that took us in helped us navigate birthdays and holidays without the shadow of Dad's expectations. They taught us that discipline didn't require fear, that strength didn't mean enduring abuse. They showed us what stable, sober caregivers looked like. I still have nightmares sometimes. I wake up thinking I hear Dad's boots in the hallway, or Grandma stumbling into furniture, but then I remember where I am, that Tommy is safe in the next room, that his insulin is properly refrigerated and administered on schedule. The last time I saw Dad was at a grocery store 2 years later. He was in civilian clothes, looking older and somehow smaller. Our eyes met across the produce section. For a moment, I thought he might approach. Instead, he turned and walked away. I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. Tommy doesn't remember much about Grandma's house, which is a blessing. He knows he has diabetes, that he nearly died once, that we live with foster parents now, but the details have faded. He's focused on soccer practice and math homework, normal kid concerns. I keep the journal I wrote during those dark months, not to relive the trauma, but to remember how far we've come, to remind myself that speaking truth isn't betrayal, that protecting the vulnerable isn't weakness. Dad was wrong about what makes someone strong. Maria still checks in occasionally. She tells me our case changed how the county handles military families in crisis. They now require additional documentation when service members claim bias. They look closer at medical neglect, even when wrapped in patriotic rhetoric. The Johnsons sent a Christmas card last year. They'd fostered 3 more children since me, all successfully. They wrote that I'd taught them about courage, though I'd felt anything but brave during those terrifying weeks in their home. They said they still had my room ready if I ever needed it. I'm applying to colleges now, planning to study social work. My guidance counselor says my essay about overcoming adversity is compelling, though she doesn't know the full story. I write about resilience and protecting others, keeping the details vague but the emotions real. Tommy wants to be a doctor, inspired by Dr. Patel, who saved his life. He volunteers at diabetes camps, teaching younger kids how to manage their condition. He tells them that taking insulin isn't weakness. It's what keeps them strong enough to pursue their dreams. Sometimes I wonder what Dad tells himself about losing us. Whether he still sees himself as the victim, the persecuted veteran betrayed by ungrateful children. Or whether, in quiet moments, he remembers Tommy unconscious on that hospital bed and feels the weight of his choices. But mostly, I don't think about Dad at all. I focus on my future, on Tommy's health, on building a life free from manipulation and fear. We survived. We're safe. We're together. That's more than I dared hope for during those terrifying months when Dad weaponized his uniform against us. The scars remain. Trust comes slowly. Authority figures still make me nervous. But I've learned that real strength isn't about enduring abuse or staying silent. It's about protecting those who can't protect themselves, even when the whole world seems against you, even when the abuser wears a uniform and calls it love. This is the kind of wisdom most adults never figure out, and here's this kid dropping truth bombs left and right. Thanks for reading this story with me. It's been quite the emotional ride through some seriously tough territory.